Good morning. I know this will shock everyone for an academic conference that starts prompt on the button of the hour, but this panel is unique in many respects, but the main one that necessitates a prompt commencement is that there's actually 3 presentations, not 2. So it will leave less time for questions, and therefore we want to move right into the presentations and the discussion. I'm extremely pleased both to chair this panel, but especially to welcome from St. Andrews University, both Tim Wilson and Donald Holbrook. Tim will speak first, then Donald. You have their bios in the conference program, but if I could embellish them a bit, in addition to being the director of the Handa Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence, Tim Wilson is unique in the field of terrorism in that he's an historian. A recent survey of the disciplines of individuals and scholars involved in the study of terrorism ranks historians as about 6th, behind political scientists, economists, psychologists, sociologists. So it's quite unique to be an historian. Richard English, of course, is one as well. So very interesting and very important perspective, which I think is revealed in Tim's first book, Frontiers of Violence, which was a comparative historical study of political unrest in Upper Silesia in the 1920s, and then in Ireland as well. His latest book is titled Killing Strangers, How Political Violence Became Modern, which is a much more contemporary survey. And embodying, I think, the ethos of both St. Andrews University and Georgetown Center for Security Studies. Tim also has extensive practical experience and most recently was an expert witness for the New Zealand government in the royal inquiry into the Christchurch mosque attacks. Donald Holbrook is a distinguished graduate of St. Andrews, where he completed his PhD. Like many of us, actually, he spent the past years focused on Salafi jihadi threats, but has shifted in recent months to focus on violent far-right extremism. In addition to his academic credentials, he's also a consultant with the Home Office's Office of Security and Counterterrorism. And I don't think I need any introduction, although I don't think I've ever said that before. But in this audience, it's Georgetown. I don't have to say anything. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Bruce, for that typically generous welcome. I'm aware that time is tight, so by all means make uninhibited guillotining motions if I don't shut up in time. Great pleasure to kick off day 2 of the conference after the intellectual feast and banquet that was yesterday. I'm going to serve you up some leftovers from my own research, which are perhaps more lightly sautéed than deeply marinated in reflection, but I hope they'll give you something to chew on. In a typically lucid article from way back in 1981, The Causes of Terrorism, Martha Crenshaw drew a key distinction between what she called preconditions, factors that set the stage for terrorism over the long run, and precipitants, what she called specific events that immediately precede the occurrence of terrorism. And overall, I think it's a sort of defensible generalization to say most of those of us who study terrorism are much more interested in the precipitants than the preconditions. You know, preconditions are the sort of low-grade research ore that we burrow through as quickly as we can to get to the proper coalface of precipitants. I'm going to be obstinate and historical and sort of rummage around the spoil heap outside the research mine, so to speak. In other words, rather than look directly at the threat landscape, I want to look at the changing social landscape and how that perhaps has molded threats from the far right. Understanding far right violence extraordinarily impressionistically, Donald will be appalled as the precise and excellent political scientist that he is, or not political scientist, but social scientist that he is, that, you know, I'm really understanding far right violence very impressionistically. Simply violence really that is about trying to maintain or create some sort of form of inequality. I'm not going to get too definitionally bogged down there. So, without labouring the point, I hope in the week that sees the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, it seems to me not the worst occasion to reflect upon the differences between early 20th century and early 21st century right-wing violence. And really, the point of this kind of historical comparative snapshotting, putting two periods together, is to perhaps ask what seems to me one of the most interesting questions about contemporary far-right violence, which is simply, why is it not even worse? Why is there not even more of it? Donald has looked at this with some distinction on the sort of micro level, but I want to stand right back. I want to suggest that this is a real question in the sense that when we talk about neo-fascist violence, far-right violence generally, somewhere in the background is lurking the cautionary tale of the collapse of Italian democracy in 1922 and German democracy, of course, in sort of 1932 to 3. They're somewhere in the background. I want to bring them perhaps a little more into the foreground. And the reason I want to do this is, I think we need to just be a little bit aware in a longer term perspective of just how remarkable the last 10 years have been for what Kaz Mard, arguably the leading academic expert on far-right parties, disturbingly calls the mainstreaming of the far-right. If we take far-right parties as, broadly those that believe in illiberal democracy. I mean, he also makes a useful distinction between extreme far-right, in other words, kind of anti-democratic, sort of more traditionally fascist, and radical far-right, sort of more populist, democratic, but their vision of democracy is certainly not liberal democracy. Then the extent to which in the last 10 years such parties have become, what the Germans call koalitionsfähig, suitable for coalition, people we can do business with, people we can bring into government, is really very striking on the one hand. And, Mudd estimates that, these parties in general elections across Europe in the last 10 years are sort of getting about 7.5% of the vote, which may not sound too high, but is, historically, after this long period of taboo on such politics in Western Europe after 45, is really very striking. And that is, of course, only one half of the equation, because without getting too drawn into controversial matters, I think it is rather striking that some notable and venerable conservative right-wing mainstream parties, the GOP in this country, the Conservatives in the UK, are looking under rather different types of leadership than they have historically tended to enjoy. So there's a kind of arguably a hollowing out also of larger, more traditional conservative or right-wing parties. So, the far right, of course, is a very complex phenomenon, both politically and socially. I think, we're only beginning to understand some of the feedback loops and dynamics between its constituent parts. But if we look at the kind of political level that I've just alluded to of, success at the ballot box, this is also complemented, of course, by these, rather dramatic social movements that the English Defence League, Pegida in Germany, that sort of, they tend to kind of bubble up and sometimes fall apart rather quickly. But, while they're there, they're rather dramatic. And of course, then at the very far end, we have, actual political violence. Now, as I say, my starting point really is to ask, why are things not worse? In 2019, MI5 said they'd foiled 6 plots, and 3 of them were far right. And I sort of wonder, well, that at one level one could say perhaps that's it could be higher, it could be worse. And my point simply being that the last time this happened, that far right parties and movements were so mainstream, the results in the 1920s and 30s were rather dramatic, and not that one wants to conflate or abolish all these analytical distinctions between different parts of the far right. But, I think one can make an argument, especially on sort of arguments against anti-Islamization and so on and so forth, that, the sort of hardcore Breivik's, that sort of, view of the Great Replacement, I mean, one can see a recognizably decaffeinated form of that in some much more popular political platforms. So, I think there is a question to be asked there. I think also, if we look back at different types of terrorism that have afflicted Western Europe and North America, which is really my arena of analysis this morning, I think the potential reservoir of potential sympathizers or supports is arguably, at a glance, looking at the far right, far greater today than it is with, Salafist terror. I mean, that's overwhelmingly a diaspora phenomenon. I know converts matter, but it is very much a diaspora phenomenon in Western countries, so the global north. Also, I would say, New Left terror back in the 70s, which was really a sort of spin-off of the intelligentsia or sections of it. So, the potential base, to me, at least at first glance, looks rather disturbingly broad, and even more disturbing when one thinks of how easily our political systems have tended to absorb even the most spectacular incidents of far-right terror. 2 years after the Breivik massacre, the Progress Party entered coalition in Norway. Now, the Progress Party is a complex entity, and some people would not see it as far-right. But I mean, its rhetoric on against Islam was pretty strident, actually. 2 years later, they were in government. 2016, the murder of the Joe Cox, the British MP, just days before the Brexit referendum, appeared to have no discernible impact on the result. These incidents were essentially just shrugged off. So if it seems very alarmist to sort of think about far-right violence in this way, as to say really, well, is it like the 20s and 30s? Then I think it's also worth thinking, well, why does it feel alarmist? What is different? And I suppose I'll just say very briefly, I think there are differences. There's differences in scale, of course, and there are differences in kind. So just just a couple of seconds on the differences of scale, of course, and the macro context in particular that might fuel that. If you think 2020 is lousy, then you should have tried 1920. Just been a world war, 40 million people were dead. There'd just been the Russian Revolution. Conservative and liberal parties all across Europe were absolutely terrified of that being repeated. And however bad some of the economic predictions on Brexit and the fate of the future British pound are, perhaps I'm naively optimistic, but I certainly hope, that we will not end up like the German finance ministry that in the middle of hyperinflation in 1923 had to pay its own staff in potatoes. So, bad as things may be, they could be a lot worse. So that's just a word on sort of differences in scale of violence. I think we need to acknowledge that, the sort of macro factors that might drive that, the contingencies, they may not be great, but I think they are certainly more benign than 100 years ago. But I think perhaps where I want to sort of put most emphasis is in this kind of the differences in kinds of far-right violence. What has shifted? And I think in sort of soundbite bullet point terms, I think there's been an enormous shift. There's what I would, if you'll pardon my language, what I tend to think of as a grand laxative turn in how these things are structured. Far-right violence has gone very loosey-goosey, to borrow a phrase from yesterday that I enjoyed. And the biggest shift, the biggest change, I think, in recent decades, of course, and Bruce was early onto this, I think as early as 1992, if not earlier, has been this shift towards what has been called leaderless resistance, a sort of shift from Führer cults towards leaderless resistance, the dominance of a sort of libertarian American model, really, over a kind of old school European statist model that really wanted to sort of worship a strong state, wanted to capture it and use it for the right. But there's been a shift from that statism towards a sort of armed anarchy of the right, a shift from Nazism to narcissism, if I can put it that way. Now, there's a lot going on here. Beam, of course, is the guy who came up with this soundbite of leaderless resistance. There were, I think, he deserves the credit, if such it be, for that. So there is certainly agency here, but I suppose I just want to draw attention in the spirit of which I opened the paper of background conditions. There have been forces, I think, pushing, both in terms of state capacity, but also in terms of social change, towards that model of leaderless resistance, developing some purchase and some resonance, if you like, in wider society. Putting it simply, Western societies in the early 21st century are far more individualistic, far less militaristic than they were 100 years ago. You often hear the hippies achieved nothing. Well, arguably one of the things that the hippies did achieve or help achieve was a pretty profound demilitarization of Western society. Look at the Beatles in their mock uniforms and make love not war and all that. I'm not saying that was the only factor, but Western society, particularly Western Europe, America, I understand different relationships with the military, a different historic relationship there. But to a certain extent, we're in a very, very different position I'll give you one trivial example, or perhaps not trivial, one rather telling example. 100 years ago, the Chancellor of St Andrews University was Douglas Haig, the butcher of the Somme, the man who presided over the worst day in British military history. I hope the Chancellor will forgive the cheap flattery if I say that I think our criteria for selecting Chancellors has rather improved over 100 years. But the wider point is more serious. There was a sort of cultural, well, more than respect, a cultural valorization of military values and discipline above all else, a point I might return to. And, what we see now, I think, is something very different. Leaderless resistance sometimes seems to me a misnomer. It might be better described as a kind of resistance of infinite leadership. Everyone wants to be Napoleon. And this kind of model that being come up with is absolutely the opposite, of course, of how classical fascism or Nazism worked. And I apologize for blasting you with Mein Kampf this early in the morning, but Hitler back in 1926 wrote, "What we needed and still need are not 100 or 200 reckless conspirators, but 100,000 and a second 100,000 fighters for our philosophy of life. We shall not work in small conventicles, but in mighty mass demonstrations. And it is not by dagger and poison and pistol that the road be cleared for the movement, but by the conquest of the streets." And if time is still on my side, I would say that this, if I can take. I don't usually take my cue from Adolf Hitler, but if I take my cue from Hitler on this importance of the conquest of the streets, this seems to me one of the enormous things that has changed. Street violence today from the far right is very, very different. Far-right violence in the 20s and 30s was calibrated. It took place in a society that had a much higher tolerance for public violence. Just over 100 years ago, 15,000 people could turn out to watch a lynching in Waco, Texas. So culturally and socially, our tolerance of public violence has gone down. Hopefully, despite lingering concerns, police tolerance has also gone down. But the point about what the fascists did was a calibrated strategy of not attacking the state head on, but causing mayhem in the streets. But it was mayhem you could turn on and off like a tap. Great historian Eric Hobsbawm, who remembers, was in Germany when the Nazis took over in 1933, said in the 1990s, what you're seeing with the burning of asylum seekers is a totally different phenomenon. Street corner Nazis would not have done that. They would not have done that spontaneously without orders. It's a different thing. So, very briefly, because time presses, the thing I think that's notable about most recent sort of cause célèbres, was sort of street demonstration, Charlottesville, August 2017, Chemnitz in Germany, 2018, is they're tiny. They're tiny by the comparisons of the 20s and 30s. If you compare, they're sort of 1,000 or low thousands of demonstrators at their worst. I'm not saying that they're not important. I'm not saying they don't get media attention. But compared to classical fascist tactics, they are very small phenomenon. In 1931, the brown shirts could put 60,000 SA men into Braunschweig, and a 6-hour parade, and tons of violence on the fringes of it. July 32, 400 street battles in Berlin alone. We don't seem to be seeing that. I would also say that the decline in militarism is we don't really see this old-style far-right model of trying to hollow out the military from within and create some sort of, stage some sort of coup. Organisation Consul, early days of the Weimar Republic, 22. Did that, the Cagoulards, the hooded ones in the French military in the 1930s, the OAS during the Algerian trauma. Those were all movements that tried to stage, and arguably to some extent, some of the elements of the far right in Italy in the early 70s. There was still a kind of statist model that you would take over bits of the state and sort of, perhaps stage a coup from within. I think that model has just entirely disappeared. Somewhere lurking in the Turner diaries is some end goal of creating some sort of strong state, but that's not really where it seems to me, where the enthusiasm and the emphasis is at. So I think we need to factor in this enormous cultural shift away from militarism, particularly, as I say, in Western Europe. Cara, distinguished alumna from our program, made an excellent point to me yesterday about this, this huge concern about 200 officers in the German army. I think similar problems in Canada. People the far-right extremists are sort of turning up in the military, and does this kind of indicate that the militaries are sort of hotbeds of reaction? Well, probably not. It's probably one of the few places you can just actually get practical training in how to use weapons in countries that don't have the US tradition of that. If you think of Anders Breivik, I mean, he designed his homemade uniforms and appeared in court in them, and it was object of utter ridicule. So it seems to me, just in finishing up in the last couple of minutes, that really the sort of far-right violence that we're seeing is something really very different, and the militarism in it is very superficial and kind of theatrical, and that actually what drives it, thinking of the more spectacular instances of the Norwegian and New Zealand massacres, is actually a very different ethic. It's a sort of performance ethic. Terrorism is theatre. Brian Jenkins famously said all those decades ago, well, they're trying to make it cinema. It's much more about getting attention. It's much more about a sort of romantic Nietzschean transgression of liberal pieties. And it's, I haven't even got onto the Incel movement, which is, I think sort of in many ways reinforces the point. But, we're a long way away from classical militarism and fascism when we get to the Incels. I mean, the Incels sort of take the feminist slogan, the personal is political, and take it, they turn it into, solipsism is political. It's just their utterly self-obsessed movement. I mean, a really quite extraordinary social phenomenon, but I'm afraid not one that I see evaporating soon. There are fads in violence, as in everything else. Suddenly there was the vehicle attacks were all the thing a couple of years ago. Suddenly they stopped. But it seems to me that the actual cultural drivers for something like the Incel movement are much deeper. They are the losers of the sexual revolution, and when sexual satisfaction becomes seen as an entitlement, those who don't get it can see themselves as oppressed, because, if there is one form of endlessly renewable energy in this world of ours, it's self-pity. On that stirring note, I guess I'll wrap up. But really the point is, there's good news and there's bad news. There's a lot of things we don't have to worry about. Things are a lot better than they were in the early 20th century. But, to use a phrase from the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, I rather fear that morbid symptoms will continue to abound. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning. I'm going to take a slightly narrower approach from the one that Tim took to look at non-state violent actors who can be grouped under this right-wing extremist milieu. But in doing so, I want to approach them relatively broadly as well. And what I want to do is to make two observations, assertions perhaps, about right-wing extremist violence, and then that sort of leads on to a third point. The first observation, suggestion, is that the extreme right wing is not an ideology, it's not a movement in any conventional sense of the word. And that has consequences not just for academics as they're trying to get their heads around what we're dealing with at the moment, but also for practitioners, for policymakers who are trying to grasp how to prioritize, for example, resources as they tackle what is a very disparate entity. The second observation is that whilst we are arguably experiencing a surge in right-wing extremist violence, if you look at a number of investigations, whether that's in this country or elsewhere, the ideas that underpin that surge in themselves are not new, which begs another question, which is, why is this then a growing problem today? If I begin with the first assertion, the extreme right wing is not an ideology, not in any conventional sense. If an ideology consists of systems of beliefs with some kind of collective property, some kind of collective purpose, the extreme right wing simply isn't it. There is no common enemy within the extreme right wing. There is no shared agenda. There is no shared vision for a way forward. We don't even have a particularly clear academic definition about what the extreme right wing is. It ranges from groups that are prepared to participate in politics, essentially, and Tim mentioned the mainstreaming of a lot of this kind of stuff, but that nevertheless remains within a relatively standard party political competition, and then obviously organizations and individuals who are prepared to carry out acts of violence. So at best, the extreme right wing is an umbrella term that contains a lot of different organizations and movements that can be quite contradictory, that can be quite heterogeneous. Even if, for the sake of argument, we narrow down, we zoom in on the white supremacist current within the extreme right-wing milieu, we encounter stark contradictions and disagreements within this substrand. There are disagreements, contradictions, for example, in geopolitics, and there always have been. There's a lot of debate at the moment, for example, about the Ukraine. The Ukraine has been a mobilizing force in some sense for individuals who have joined paramilitary and even parts of the Ukrainian military, things like the Azov battalion, which is modeled on an SS division which fought in the Ukraine and is very much part of the extreme right wing. But white supremacists have also joined Russian-backed forces fighting in the Ukraine, effectively fighting other white supremacists. At the same time, you have white supremacists who are related to those individuals and movements who have condemned the war and condemned those fighting both on the side of Russia and on the side of Ukraine, and it's a very sensitive topic in various places such as the Balkans. The role of religion for white supremacists is inherently complex and contradictory. You have Norse pagan movements, interpretation of kind of romanticized versions of Norse paganism that stretches back to some of what Tim was talking about in terms of the early 20th century and way in which that kind of religious pedigree was being reinterpreted. But there are all sorts of other types of paganism. Well, South Asian versions are in vogue at the moment. People are digging up authors like Ulyss Evola, Savitri Devi, and others who wrote about how we can learn from Hinduism. There are very, very obscure esoteric religions, even satanic cults, Hitler-worshipping satanic cults, which have existed for decades, but again are rising in prominence now. There are vehemently anti-Christian white supremacist groups and movements, as well as pro-Christian and Christian supremacy parts and strands of white supremacy movements. There's a thread stretching right back from the British Israelites to Christian identity movements in the US, to so-called neo-crusaders, and we might put Anders Breivik in that category as well, although I'll get back to him in a bit. There are disputes over history, there are disputes over key issues like climate change. Tim came onto this a little bit. This is sort of classical National Socialist model of the industrialization is encountering a counter-argument of so-called eco-fascists, the green fascists. You even see some of the extreme right-wing responding to some of this kind of grassroots environmental agenda, which has usually been attached to the grassroots left and sometimes the hard left, with individuals reminding an audience that this is also, or can also be, associated with extreme right wing as well. If you read Patrick Crusius's manifesto in wake of the El Paso attack, you see a very strong environmental element there as well. There are alternative visions regarding gender roles. We're going to be talking about that a little bit later in the session, on sexuality, on governance. Again, Tim mentioned this as well. Normally, you would have thought white supremacists model themselves as Nazis and are therefore fascists, but you also have an anarchic element emerging within this milieu as well. Endless debates about tactics, endless debates about leadership. Tim talked about everybody wanting to be Napoleon. Everybody also wants to be Hitler, which is why these kind of white supremacist groups fall out all the time. There's a quote from a Swedish historian called Matthias Gardell, which I quite like, which kind of encapsulates the problem that we have. He said, and I quote, "Aryan movements and organizations populating the counterculture are as disparate as the belief systems and conceptions of reality are divergent from each other. Any effort to create an organizational catalogue of even just the white supremacist subcurrent is already obsolete when it leaves the researcher's desk for the print shop," end quote. And I think those observations are very much valid still today. If we broaden our perspective a little bit more, beyond the white supremacist current, but remain within a very clear category of extreme right-wing violence and terrorism, even starker contradictions emerge about the composition of the in-group, about the definitions of the out-group, and how to deal with the latter. A central divergence which has emerged and has become particularly prominent in recent years, perhaps a recent decade, concerns the role of Islam. As we know, anti-immigrant, particularly anti-Islamic groups have emerged and risen in prominence in Europe and in this country and elsewhere. But they spawn everything from relatively normal-looking quasi-political grassroots movements, some purport to be non-violent, as well as lone actors, individuals like Brenton Tarrant, the New Zealand attacker, Patrick Crucius, whom I mentioned, and Anders Breivik, whom Tim referred to, carried out a massacre in Norway in July 2011. But again, these anti-Islamic elements of the extreme right wing come from a number of different ideological directions. Some use clear kind of Norse pagan imagery. Others pretend to be different kinds of neo-pagans. And others still adopt this kind of so-called identitarian model, this sort of cultural, ethno-cultural element, and often use Christian labels and descriptors as well, as in fact Breivik did. Breivik is an interesting case in point because in court he did the Hitler salute, very much part of that performative element, that theatrical element that Tim talked about. But he was no normal Nazi. In fact, arguably, he was barely a Nazi. If we read his 1,500-page manifesto, and I don't suggest that you do, but we see the way in which he refers to National Socialism, National Socialist pedigree in Europe, and even things like anti-Semitism, which he regarded as a distraction, which he regarded as something which wasn't essentially a problem for what he was trying to get at, which was very much immigration from Muslim-majority countries in North Africa and the Middle East, and then higher birth rates of those migrant populations in Europe. That's what Breivik was talking about. Tarrant echoed those sentiments using very similar language and obviously talked about being inspired by Breivik 10 years later. Breivik was very keen on his own iconography, his own symbols, and spent years designing those as much as he did planning his attacks. And he designed for himself a logo which shows a skull being pierced by a sword or a cross. And the skull has three symbols. It has the symbol representing the Soviet Union, which for him was left liberalism in Europe. It was the crescent moon representing Islam, but it was also the swastika, because the swastika for him was something which he wanted to draw a line under and focus on something very, very different. But on the topic of Islam, what complicates matters further is that Islam and Islamic extremism, jihadism in particular, have inspired various different elements within the extreme right wing. If we go back to the 1970s, for example, we see individuals and groups like Ben Klassen, who founded a movement called the World Church of Creator in North Carolina, wrote a book called White Man's Bible, which was quite prominent at the time and continues to be widely read now, where he referred to Islam as an inspiration for the white race, because in his words, the white race could learn from the creation of what he described as an aggressive and well-directed religion. In the UK, British neo-Nazi organizations as late as the early 2000s referred to Palestinians and the Palestinian cause as being something to be sympathetic towards, expressed their support for Arab militias fighting Israel. And indeed, if we read the Turner Diaries, written by William Pierce in 1978, and a widely read dystopian fiction within this milieu, the ultimate demise of Israel is brought about not by white supremacists, but by Arabs. And he refers to occupied Palestine, he refers to oppressed Palestinians. Breivik is said to have read the Turner Diaries and absolutely hated it. Neo-Nazi groups have praised 9/11, Al-Qaeda, jihadis, bin Laden, as we heard yesterday. Some key figures within this movement, including David Mamet, whose organization, the Order of the Nine Angles, takes a more satanic approach, even converted to Islam in 1998, as have some other figures within this movement. More bizarrely and more recently, elements within this scene, groups like Atomwaffen Division, National Action that we heard about yesterday in the UK, Sonnenkrieg Division, these kind of more recent neo-Nazi organizations have very clearly sought to emulate at least the aesthetics of ISIS. They talk about white jihad, they use an index-fingered salute, which is the Tawheed symbol that jihadis often use, and various other symbols that have been popularized by jihadis, seeking to learn from, perhaps emulate some of the elements of jihadis, just as Ben Klassen and others tried to do 40 years earlier. So to conclude, the first observation, the extreme right wing is not an ideology, it is not a movement if you adopt any kind of conventional understanding of what an ideology is. There is no consistency, there is no agreement about grievance, about how to respond to the grievance, and about who's supposed to be responsible for addressing those problems. And that, as I said, is a problem not just for academics, because these definitions tend to travel so much, but also for practitioners and policymakers who at the moment are trying to grapple and tackle what is an extremely diverse problem. Where do you focus? Where do you focus your attention when you have such a disparate set of actors? Which elements of this milieu are most likely to strike, which parts are going to be most dangerous, and that isn't necessarily in the orchestration of violence, which is our immediate concern, but also in their ability to mobilize a larger group of people, which I think is closer to what Tim was talking about. My second point is this. There's a widely talked about surge in far-right extremism. We see that in the rise in the number of investigations, plots. Certainly in this country is said to be a larger threat in terms of plots than the jihadi threat. But the ideas that underpin this are not new. A cursory glance, for example, at the white supremacist scene in this country highlight individuals like James Mason and his work called The Siege. But James Mason is 67 years old. He's very much part of the old neo-Nazi league. He was active in the 1970s and 80s, together with individuals like George Lincoln Rockwell. Siege, which talks about accelerationism and all these things that new millennial neo-Nazis are talking about, was written in the late 1970s and 80s. So none of this stuff is new. He's been reinvented, he's been given a makeover, if you like, by more tech-savvy millennials. The same case we see on the kind of more cultural identitarian scene. There's nothing new about the Great Replacement theory. The essence of that ideology stretched back to French thinkers in the mid-19th century. Other French thinkers of the 20th century added an Islamic flavor to that, but again, it isn't new. What has happened since then, as with Mason, is that these ideas have been repackaged by tech-savvy millennials, movements like Generation Identity. Tim mentioned, Antonio ended with Gramsci. This movement, even though it's right-wing, embraces Gramsci as well, who was a Marxist, particularly his model of metapolitics. Metapolitics is this idea that in order to provoke political revolution, first you need to educate the masses, which is what they do. And their output, their PR, the media is extremely slick. On the surface, they are non-violent, and in that sense have the potential of reaching a much wider audience, but at the same time, they have the ability to inspire acts of violence, including Brenton Tarrant, whose manifesto was called Great Replacement, which is very much the ideology of Generation Identity. Which brings me to my third point. If these are old ideas, why are we experiencing this surge now? And I'm not going to suggest that I have answers to those questions, certainly not in the time that I have left, but let me suggest two concepts from the behavioral social sciences, which we as a center have talked about for quite some time and have been interested in for a while, and I think they're helpful. One of them is the concept of affordance, which traces its origins to an American psychologist called James Gibson and refers to the quality of an environment that enables, facilitates, or makes possible an action. Or put more simply, what the environment offers to the individual. And arguably here, the most significant changes in this regard come with social media, which Jonathan Evans talked about yesterday, which traces its genesis back less than 20 years, very much coinciding with the beginning of the surge of support for extreme right-wing movements among a new generation. The costs, as we know, of creating new, globally linked, clandestine, closed, if necessary, communities, however niche, unpleasant, or weird they might be, is now virtually zero, a problem which was highlighted by a report from the Department of Homeland Security called the Strategic Framework for Countering Terrorism and Targeted Violence, came out last year, and I urge you all to read if you haven't done so already, where they pointed out that the proliferation of online tools, and I quote, help people see themselves as part of communities and causes that transcend national borders, provide users with a sense of intimacy with people and groups half a world away, and embolden the adoption of identities and causes that may once have been obscure, marginalized, or otherwise unknown, end quote. And you can see very obviously how this empowers, perhaps gives a sense of legitimacy to a whole bunch of obscure individuals who in the past, if we take Jonathan's analogy of somebody going to a post office, sending an envelope and waiting for a response that never comes, wasn't going to happen. A second and related concept comes from social movement theory and refers to frame alignment, which can be traced back to discussions also in the 1970s and 80s, where we were thinking about why individuals join social movement organizations when there isn't anything obviously tangible in it for them from a kind of material perspective. Put simply, frame alignment refers to the extent to which there's a match between individual interests, values, and beliefs on the one hand, and the activities, goals, and ideology of social movements on the other. So there's an agreement, broadly speaking, between how an individual and a movement see the world, including a shared sense of grievance, a response to that grievance, an alternative, and a vision for the future. And we can talk about a whole host of things that fall within this category: structural changes, socioeconomic changes. I think the financial collapse 12 years ago is quite significant. Change in work patterns, the availability of work, the nature of work, family patterns as a result. There are social changes, in some cases resistance to those changes. We might put the Incel movement in this category, and a broader anti-feminist movement emerging from that. Some individuals are appealed, are attracted to the sinister. The sinister is part of the appeal. Some of the more occultist, bizarre, satanic cults that we see emerging in different social media corners like Discord and elsewhere appear to appeal to the sense of being different, being scary, being sinister. For others, they might be mobilized by precisely the opposite, because taboos have been removed, because the language that used to be peripheral and extreme has entered the mainstream and has become acceptable. In truth, no doubt, it's a combination both of the opportunities afforded by new networks, new technology, and a shift in people's realities and their interpretation of those realities that we're now arguably experiencing a surge and proliferation, not of a single extreme right-wing movement, but a number of different and often contradictory extreme right-wing movements that all have the desire to provoke some kind of revolution and often to inspire violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald and Tim. Brilliant presentations, and not least, bang on time. I will wrap up. The title of this part of the session is Assessing the Threat of Incel Violence. If I could make 4 points before I begin, or 3 points actually. Firstly, this is a summary of preliminary research that is in draft form that will be turned into a scholarly article, and one of the main parts of our summary is the typology that myself and my collaborators have developed on how to view incels. Secondly, I am one of 3 authors of this. This has been a completely joint and cooperative venture. SSP graduate Jacob Ware is a co-author. A current SSP student, Ezra Shapiro, is another co-author. It's been immensely valuable for me, especially, to work with two such young and talented scholars. And I have to give a shout out to another SSP student, Ian Worthington, who last year gave a brilliant briefing in Professor Sturm's course and really served to focus my attention on the incel threat. And then finally, even though I grew up in the Bronx and have absolutely no hesitation to use various lewd and foul language when I'm driving around the DMV area, I'm not always comfortable using it in such august settings as the Copley Formal Lounge. So I hope you'll forgive me if I do actually refer in my quotes to the incels' actual language. Does the violently oriented incel movement pose a terrorist threat? In recent years, an increase in attacks linked to the extreme fringe of this loosely organized virtual community has generated great concern. Predominantly comprised of young males who congregate on various online forums, incels assail what they believe are the social injustices wrought by genetic determinism and female preferences that have relegated them to the margins of society. Although only a handful of violent incidents have been linked to this movement, including shootings, stabbings, and vehicular attacks, the number of fatalities has climbed to nearly 50 since the first named incel attack occurred in 2014. In addition, extremist incels have increasingly displayed ideological affinity with male supremacy and white supremacy, white nationalism. The term incel, a contraction of involuntary celibate, takes its name from a website created in 1993 by a young female undergraduate at Canada's Carleton University, which she eponymously titled Alana's Celibacy Project. It and other contemporaneous sites aim to give individuals an outlet for expressing frustration, but more than that, to provide support and rehabilitation for romantically alienated individuals. Moreover, these early sites admitted both men and women. An incel was simply one who had not had sex in at least 6 months despite trying. But as internet culture evolved in the early years of the 21st century, it developed its own unique culture, which incel forums consequently began to reflect. Two of the most popular forum platforms, 4chan, founded in 2003, and Reddit, founded in 2005, encouraged extremist declamations in order to acquire greater visibility. Though incel forums were at this point spread across cyberspace rather than confined to these main sites, they nonetheless began to espouse similarly edgy and at times extremist sentiment. Over this period, these forums became more radical, thus ending or drowning out many of the previous debates about inceldom. A militant incel identity began to coalesce around several common characteristics, including viewing society as a caste system determined by sexual attractiveness, where women made decisions about sexual partners based on physical appearance, that the lonely status of incels was immutable because of their height, stature, or religion, and that incels would be perpetually relegated to this position so long as women had power to choose their partners. The difference between these lamentations and prior ones was the conclusion and belief that it was incumbent on those embracing the term or the label incel to act, to take control of their lives and exact revenge for the dismissive and derogatory way they felt they were being treated. The foremost exemplar of this new trend was 22-year-old Elliot Rodger. On May 23, 2014, Rodger stabbed 3 of his roommates to death before embarking on a shooting spree in Isla Vista, California, a neighborhood favored by students at the nearby University of California at Santa Barbara, that claimed 3 more lives. Rodger thus became the first self-identified incel to go beyond the violent rhetoric of cyberspace and translate thought into homicidal action. Rodger explained that his day of retribution, as he styled it, was intended both to punish women and to inspire imitation and emulation. After the shooting, some incel forum users reportedly lauded Rodger's attack and spoke of carrying out similar acts. Such praise would prove prophetic. In any case, Reddit now became the go-to site for incels, who gravitated to subreddit r/incels. By 2016, the Reddit incel community had 40,000 users. Then in 2017, Reddit banned the subreddit for repeatedly violating the website's ban on violent incitement. A tamer, more heavily moderated version of r/incels, called r/braincells, subsequently surfaced, but it too was banned in October 2019. At its height, the successor site had attracted only around half the number of users as the original. Today, incel forums are dispersed across Reddit, 4chan, online community gaming forums like Discord, and websites like incels.co and incels.net. There are now dozens of such forums, from Reddit subreddits to incels.co to 4chan and 8chan, and its now defunct replacement, 8kun, each with only a few thousand members. Admittedly, the incel worldview is not obviously political. But because its core ethos revolves around the subjugation and repression of a group, and its violence is designed to affect far-reaching societal effects, incel violence arguably conforms to an emergent trend in terrorism with a salient hate crime dimension. As a January 2020 Texas law enforcement assessment notes, what begins as a personal grievance due to perceived rejection by women may morph into allegiance to and attempts to further an incel rebellion. In addition, the absence of a clear, coherent, universally agreed upon incel ideology also frustrates efforts to categorize violent incels as terrorists. The community's amorphous nature also explains the absence of a common strategy or even common tactics. But even if the more extreme and violent camp of the incel community do not completely conform to traditional notions of terrorism, the fact that they deliberately target a clearly defined outgroup, often with designs on fomenting a broader societal revolution, does constitute a form of political violence akin to terrorism. To better assess and understand the motivations and dynamics of this violence, we consider incel violence as fitting into 4 categories. First, there are clear incel-motivated terrorist attacks. Second, there are attacks with mixed motives that evidence incel ideological influences. Third, there are acts of targeted violence perpetrated by self-professed involuntary celibates. And finally, there's what we term post-facto inceldom. Let me discuss each in that order. So clear incel-motivated terrorist attacks. This is the most important category for our research, since these acts of political violence have explicit political and ideological aims. They are committed by males claiming to be part of the incel community via its online presence. In all these cases, the attackers publicly expressed their motivation and were primarily driven by their inceldom. That is, their declared affiliation with and adherence to the violent incel movement. To date, there have been at least 3 clear incel-motivated terrorist attacks. The first recognized incident, as previously mentioned, was Elliot Rodgers' 2014 attempted attack on a particularly popular sorority house on the Santa Barbara campus. After failing to gain entry, he targeted random passersby on the streets of Isla Vista. As has become common for today's violent far-right extremists, Roger left behind a 141-page manifesto titled My Twisted Life. The screed outlined his grievances and justifications for the attacks. He also posted numerous misogynistic videos on YouTube outlining his sense of alienation and rejection and hatred of women. As the first self-identified violent incel, Roger has since come to be regarded by the movement's adherents as its patron saint. Extremist incels, for instance, routinely encourage one another to go ER, that is, to follow Roger's murderous precedent by engaging in similar acts of terrorism before taking their own lives. The deadliest incel attack inspired by Roger's example occurred 4 years later in Toronto, Canada. A 25-year-old male named Alec Manassian drove a rented van through one of the city's busiest streets, striking pedestrians and ultimately killing 10 persons, 8 of whom were women. The third unambiguous incel attack occurred in November 2018, when 2 women were murdered by Scott Biarley at a yoga studio in Tallahassee, Florida. Biarli then committed suicide. He was a longtime adherent to involuntary celibate ideologies and posted videos on YouTube and music on SoundCloud outlining his misogynist views and expressing support for his incel predecessors. The most important distinguishing feature of this category is the specific targeting of women in each of these attacks, the main source of the incel movement's animus. It also reveals the learning curve apparent among incel terrorists. After Rogers' attempted shooting rampage at the Alpha Pi sorority house, he proceeded to drive through the streets of Isla Vista, striking pedestrians between random gunshots. Not only did Manassian cite Roger as his inspiration, he also followed his lead with his own vehicular attack, telling the detective who later interviewed him that he had derived the idea of using a vehicle to carry out his attack from Roger. Biarli, meanwhile, emulated Roger's example in selecting a target specifically frequented by women, which would therefore leave no doubt to his motivation. Second, we come to attacks with mixed motives. This category embraces attackers who espouse or identify with incel ideology and hence frame their violence within that context. The distinguishing factor of these incidents, however, is that they are not obviously perpetrated expressly for political purposes or in furtherance of the incel agenda. Rather, the perpetrator simply refers to or mentions incel ideology in explaining or justifying their violence. Of the 3 violent attacks in this category, the first occurred in October 2015 when Christopher Harper Mercer opened fire at an Oregon community college, killing 9 persons. The second in December 2017 when William Atchison murdered 2 students at a New Mexico high school. And the third in February 2018 with the mass shooting at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida by Nicholas Cruz, where 17 persons were killed and as many others wounded. One additional incident is a failed attack in June 2019 in which Brian Clyde was shot to death by police after exchanging gunfire in front of a Dallas, Texas courthouse. Each of the perpetrators had previously referenced some aspect of inceldom prior to the attacks in online postings. Harper Mercer, Atchison, and Cruz all outwardly expressed a fascination with incel ideology and their admiration for Elliot Rodger, but their attacks were less clearly and perhaps not necessarily directly motivated by incel ideology. Significantly, too, the attacks in this category do not appear to have deliberately targeted women. Instead, each involved a college or a school, perhaps further indicating the absence of a political motive. Third is targeted violence perpetrated by self-professed involuntary celibates. Here we draw the distinction between incels who subscribe to the ideology and political movement and males who simply identify themselves as involuntary celibates. In this category, we include targeted acts of violence, including murders and assaults, perpetrated by persons who may refer to themselves as incels or apparently are cognizant of the incel ideology, but not otherwise firmly situated within it. To be clear, these are not political terrorist attacks or even hate crimes. The assailants are not specifically self-declared members of the incel community, but their violent acts evidence the role that misogyny and sexual frustration can play in sparking violence among young males, even when the target is seemingly random. And finally, we have post facto inceldom. In addition to the above, it is important to note an entirely different category, whereby the incel community retroactively inducts past attackers predating Elliot Rodger into a virtual pantheon of incel heroes. While many of these males could not have been part of online incel communities, as their actions long preceded the advent of most of these online forums, their violent acts nonetheless conform to the patterns of social isolation generally and rejection by women specifically that have come to animate subsequent incel violence. A particularly worrisome trend is how seamlessly the militant incel community has fit into the alt-right and violent far-right tapestry, with common grievances and intermingling membership bringing these movements closer together. Whether or not they are specifically intrinsic to the incel narrative racial themes are functionally inextricable from incel ideology. Elliot Rodgers' manifesto, for instance, was a thoroughly racist document. Many incels also rail against Jews. Though not necessarily part and parcel of the cultural narrative, the classic anti-Semitic refrain about Jews controlling society through government, banks, and the media is relatively common among incels in identifying the causes of societal decay. In fact, several of the incel attackers discussed here have also professed vehemently anti-Semitic views. Incels, like their more extreme far-right brethren, also despise feminism, arguing that more progressive policies towards gender equality are at the root of many of the globe's problems. While incels perceive that they are rejected by society writ large, their ire is specifically directed against women. Part of this anger is the product of individual loneliness. The other, more ideological factor is their argument that society has become an oppressive matriarchy. Incels thus describe their ideal world as traditional and family-oriented. Reactionary views permeate incel discourse, and though this is not an inherently far-right worldview, a common refrain in such forums is nostalgia for the quote-unquote good old days, when men had more control over women, monogamy was the norm, and it was allegedly easier to find a spouse. Feminism, allegedly, has robbed incels of the right to a wife and sex, which some incels seek to redress through violence. In fact, some incels argue that the denial of sex constitutes a reverse rape, and that such offenses are as harmful as real rapes. Far-right online communities have noticed the incels' racial and men's rights undertones and have thereby sought to deepen ties between their movements. Incels and far-right adherents now regularly openly intermingle on sites like Reddit and 8kun. Opposition to feminism, the most fundamental shared belief between these two extremisms, is often described as the gateway to more recognized far-right extremist ideology. Indeed, the online manosphere and related men's rights activism has become a breeding ground for racist, anti-Semitic, and anti-LGBTQ views. Several European far-right attackers have also displayed incel tendencies, whether in public statements or their profiles. The 18-year-old perpetrator of the July 2016 mass shooting in Munich, Germany, had been in close contact with Atchison, the New Mexico school shooter, who would write an obituary for his friend after the former's attack. The gunman who attacked a mosque in Bærum, Norway in August 2019 referenced incel memes prior to his largely failed attack. And the perpetrator of an October 2019 shooting at a synagogue and kebab shop on the sacred Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur in Halle, Germany, confessed to his crimes by claiming that immigrants had stopped him from getting a girlfriend. Finally, incel violence shares a similarity with violent far-right extremism in that attacks are disproportionately committed by former, mostly undistinguished members of the military. Of the 7 attackers who committed either a clear incel-motivated terrorist attack or an attack with mixed motives that evidenced incel ideological influences, 5 had some degree of military training. Now, let me emphasize, we are not at all saying that persons serving in the military or military veterans are any more susceptible or prone to join violent far-right or violent far-left or incel extremist movements. It's rather that over the past 20 years, in all of our countries, there is a far larger pool of individuals who, as is memorably pointed out in the book Shadowlands, have experience of insurgency, having fought in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So there's a larger pool that these movements are deliberately singling out and seeking to attract and recruit because of their expertise in warfare. So let me very briefly conclude. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of the incel movement's mobilization to violence is that there are no obvious legal measures or counterterrorism intelligence initiatives available. The movement is completely decentralized without any hierarchy or leaders, and therefore no targetable offline organizing or funding streams exist. It is also difficult to identify and enlist persons with similarly extremist views but who eschew violence, who could serve as interlocutors or moderate bridges, as is done with other countering violent extremism initiatives. Domestic law enforcement agencies cannot, of course, legally track online speech or police language. And even so, incels pride themselves on their aforementioned penchant for shitposting, where they say increasingly outlandish and vicious things for fun rather than as a legitimate threat. Policing social media forums and their content might potentially risk creating new monitoring problems by forcing incels deeper into the dark web, where oversight is more difficult and increasingly violent rhetoric can more safely be propagated. Alongside the violent far right and Islamist homegrown extremist threats, incels also conform to an increasingly pervasive trend of attacks perpetrated by individuals without any connection to an existing organization, with known leaders or an identifiable command and control structure. They are thus part of a broader rise of domestic terrorism threats and needs to be taken equally seriously by law enforcement and the counterterrorism community before the movement continues to grow in size and threat. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's now open the floor for questions. Much like yesterday, if we could pool 2 or 3 questions at a time, that would be ideal. And also, if you could keep your questions as brief as possible. Eric?
Hello? Okay. So last night, a story was published in The Guardian that the leader of, over the previous week, the FBI has been mopping up a neo-Nazi terror group who calls themselves the Base. Last night, The Guardian published an article that it was run by an 40-something American expatriate living in St. Petersburg, which leads into my question: are we facing a white power international, a white power milieu, primarily organizing online, and where do we see this milieu going in the coming months and years?
Okay, great. Someone else? Yes, sir?
Question for Dr. Hoffman. You mentioned that incel groups tend to recruit from military professionals or build ties with various groups, but you've also said that incels are not organized groups. So how is it that non-groups are capable of doing group-like activities, essentially?
Right. Okay. And Jay?
So I was wondering, with these groups having such a large online presence, how effective is deplatforming? Sort of as they lose Reddit threads and websites, does it make it harder to access the movement? And sort of what's the trade-off between deplatforming and driving them deeper into a place where it's harder to discover sort of what they're doing?
Okay, sounds good. Do
They're
we
all
talk
about
about
the
the
future.
global
I'm a
milieu
historian.
or
Take it away.
the deplatforming?
Yeah, why don't I address the first question about the white power milieu, which I think is very interesting. We certainly have seen, I don't think this is a new thing, by the way, but a lot of conversations between like-minded groups in Europe and their counterparts in the US. The most obvious example of that, I mean, the Base is a very recent example. The Russia element there may well have an element of intelligent design. We don't know. I mean, Russia has its own issues with white supremacism that are anti-Putin. At the same time, the Kremlin sees the purpose of supporting some of those organizations at the same time. But National Action, which is a prescribed neo-Nazi organization in the UK, which emerged in 2013, clearly had conversations with counterparts that became, for example, Atomwaffen Division in this country, where there have been quite substantial amounts of communication between the two, both about ideology but also about things like capability. So a big thing that British neo-Nazis are after is weapons training and the ability to try and use firearms and come over here and go to shooting ranges and that kind of stuff. And then there's that kind of fusion about shared vision of the world and what to do about it. So again, it's not new. I mean, academics like Leonard Weinberg have talked about the relationship across the Atlantic of different white supremacist organizations, stretching back to the 70s, and they feed off each other and learn from each other. And neo-fascist organizations in the UK in the 80s had as keynote speakers prominent individuals like William Pierce coming to London. So it's not new, but it's facilitated very much by new technology. And as I say, the capability element, particularly in the UK, is a big concern. That can be enhanced due to expertise in this country to do with firearms and so on. Deplatforming very quickly. I think, yes, it has been an issue we've seen, particularly with Twitter and other big social media companies increasingly responding to particularly the more obvious elements of the white supremacist element of the extreme right wing, that individuals have lost their presence there, so they migrate to platforms like Gab that are more prepared to tolerate that kind of discourse. What's happening there, as we've seen, for example, with ISIS, is that they certainly aren't pushed offline. They find new ways in which to talk to each other. Perhaps an added element, though, is that there's a tendency that they will be preaching to the converted, and that's a frustration for them, as we see with organizations like ISIS, that they will need to, and depending on where they're coming from ideologically, to find a way in which to reach out to a wider population. So it's a concern. But they certainly haven't lost the ability to speak to each other on social media, and they will find different ways on the dark web, which is increasingly prominent in this field as well.
Very little to add. I won't address deplatforming as a technophobe that I am. I couldn't possibly compete with what Donald said there. I mean, I think on the sort of international networking momentum aspect of it, yes, I mean, clearly that has been going on for a while and does seem to be accelerating. I mean, what struck me about the base was just how, or at least the media reports I saw, was just, again, really just reinforcing my point. I mean, was this serious militarism? I mean, these sort of rituals of sacrificing goats and, you know, their kind of fantasy of how civil war would start, that we could be like literally hunting humans. I mean, it sort of all sounds very much like a computer game, really. So I think there's sort of more private satisfactions or small group satisfactions bubbling up there. But no, I hadn't heard that Russia dimension, and as Donald said, if there is an element of intelligent design, that rather changes the equation. But I don't think we should be surprised by these things. And certainly, you know, a few years back, when it was sort of becoming obvious that the internet was creating these kind of echo chambers and you know sub fora, then I mean that it seems to me that, you know, that was one of the satisfactions, that you sort of have the global dimension was absolutely crucial, because you could have your own sort of private Nuremberg rally in your head, you know, sort of feeling like there wasn't an audience out there that was applauding what you did. But, you know, obviously we can try and drive that, we can try and control that, but as Bruce has already said, you know, there's trade-offs.
Right. Very briefly, in terms of the actual details of the Guardian story, offline you should speak with Jacob Ware, my co-author, who's been following this closely and lost several hours of sleep because of the attention he's paid to it. What I would say, mostly from talking to Jacob, though, because I hadn't seen it, and the very thorough debriefing he gave me, is, firstly, I mean, this fits exactly into an argument I made at the paper I delivered at St. Andrews University for the first bookend of this conference, that the distinction between domestic and international terrorism is completely eroding, and in an era of social media is becoming almost meaningless. Secondly, I don't think there's any surprise that these movements are being taken advantage of, and indeed being manipulated by Russia and other countries. I mean, this is already a problem that Scandinavian authorities are very concerned about. Doesn't surprise me in the least that it spread to the United States. Again, it underscores my point to the challenges of countering terrorism today. Norman Spear is not Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. I mean, he is not issuing orders and functioning in any traditional command and control space as we're familiar with terrorism. So even though the base is an organization, it is not like its namesake, Al-Qaeda. I mean, it's something that conforms exactly to what I'm talking about with Inceldom, something that's more virtual and inspirational and designed to emulate violence and copycat attacks. But as we know with the arrests last Thursday in Delaware, these three individuals were plotting to carry out acts of violence in Richmond, not following Norman Spear's orders, certainly encouraged and inspired by him, but this was something they were doing entirely on their own. The second question that was specifically for me, well, I mean, this is part of the problem, is you don't need an organization anymore if you have social media and people making contact with one another. I think the problem is, as I emphasize, it's not that serving military or veterans are any more inclined to these things. It's just that there's a lot more of them that bring expertise that's openly solicited, and therefore you have collections of individuals that might solicit the knowledge and expertise of even people that like Manassian, who spent 16 days in the Canadian Armed Forces. But nonetheless, people who have some familiarity with weaponry. And I would underscore the point of the famous siege out in Oregon with Ammon and Cliven Bundy was transformed when a military veteran who claimed to have served in Afghanistan, Iraq, turned up and was able to assemble and instruct a group of ranchers and farmers who certainly were skilled with weapons, but hunting rifles and shotguns, but to deploy them in ambush formations that were very confrontational. And this is what I'm talking about. It's just that this expertise is more prevalent in society than it's been at any time, at least in the United States, since the Indochina Wars. And gosh, think about the rise of the modern far-right extremist movement in the 1980s. It was pioneered by former Vietnam veterans, many by individuals who served in special forces. Bo Greitz, Randy Weaver, Louis Beam himself, Fraser Glenn Miller were all people who had served in the military, had served in what they felt were an endless war fought for no purpose by corrupt political leaders. I mean, many of the themes we see today that animated violent far-right extremism then and gave it its violent capabilities because of their expertise. And that's our only point, is that we're seeing this being replicated. Okay, more questions? Yes, sir? And we'll again collect 3.
Yes, Dr. Hoffman, regarding the Incel movement, is there any, or have you had a chance to do any analysis on an international side of it, especially in areas where they have more gender disparity, greater gender disparity?
Okay, great. Yevon? Up front, right here.
So Dr. Hoffman, you said in terms of incel activity that they say outlandish things more for theatrics than to actually show premeditated violence on the internet. That sounds a lot like internet trolls who go into internet chat forums and kind of stir the metaphorical pot. So my question is, for law enforcement officers who are trying to prevent possible incel attacks, how can they differentiate between those who are just here for the theatrics versus who are actually showing premeditated violent tendencies?
Right. And yes, that'll be the third one there. And we'll come to you in the next round.
Thank you. Have you all noticed any themes or commonalities expressed by individuals who have been affiliated with far-right extremist movements and then subsequently became disillusioned and chose to leave these movements? And if so, are there any lessons that we can learn in terms of crafting an effective counter-messaging or counter-violent extremist strategy? Thank you.
Right. Let me take the first 2 about the incel movement and then turn it over to Tim and Donald to discuss the exit question. It actually is worrisomely, I think the inceldom and the violent manifestations of it are spreading, at least with online exchanges. Again, that's the power of social media. Certainly, I would say to Europe or Northern European countries, this seems to be predominantly, but not exclusively, a phenomena of white males who feel themselves being disadvantaged. But that's not to say, it's much like the sovereign citizens movement on the extreme right, which isn't necessarily violent, but has violent manifestations, but is a huge umbrella in who they attract, so the stereotypes don't hold true. But generally speaking, when we talk about incels, it's a Northern Hemisphere much more than to date. I think there may be indications that that's changing, and there's certainly cultural norms and values in other societies that could be attracted to this ideology, but right now we've just seen it as Northern Hemisphere, North America, and Northern Europe. The second question, Yevon's point, where does the line between trolling and harassment, what's the differentiation? Of course, Lord Evans gave a brilliant disquisition on that yesterday. I think what's at least attracted myself and my co-authors' concern and interest is that, okay, there's only been roughly 7 incel attacks, but think about it, 50 people have been killed. I mean, that for terrorists, that's a pretty impressive average of number of deaths per attack. So that when they do strike, they do have much more homicidal intent. The old days when terrorism was embraced for its symbolic value, blowing up a bomb in front of a bank or attacking an embassy, national symbols, seems to have given way in the 21st century to greater proclivity to engage in acts of lethality as a means of getting attention and encouraging copycats. And that's what I say is why one has to pay attention to it. The trouble is, and you hit the nail on the head, is that the incels' tendency to shitposting, as it were, means that, a lot of it is just hot air and rhetoric and verbiage. And I think, across the board, I think this is the problem that law enforcement and intelligence face today, is there's so much noise and so much chatter. And think about it. When we had this conference 3 years ago, intelligence and law enforcement were riveted on the threat from one movement, the Salafi jihadi movement, and basically two umbrella terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I lament the fate of people in law enforcement and intelligence today who have to contend with the range of threats we're discussing at this conference, in addition to the continuing, and one doesn't want to diminish them, Salafi jihadi threats. They've now been joined by the Iranian threat network, by violent far-right extremists, and by even highly idiosyncratic, but nonetheless, an idiosyncratic movement with the potentiality for homicidal mayhem like the Incels. So we're asking law enforcement intelligence to do an enormous amount at a time when war on terrorism ended, the threat's gone, bin Laden and Baghdadi are dead, but we see other threats rising and other manifestations, which I will conclude by saying this is why there's such enormous importance and value in a center like the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence that is able to take the long view and see terrorism as a dynamic and evolutionary phenomenon, not a war that one can just declare victory over. Gentlemen? About the de-radicalization and exit.
Yeah, there's been a fair amount of work done on exit programs in Scandinavia and Germany, certainly in relation to how individuals have left neo-Nazi groups, and academics like Tori Bjorga, for example, have been involved in that. That stretches back some decades now, and there's quite a lot of learning from that. To what extent we can apply that to what we're seeing currently, we don't really know. The threat that's kind of coming from that is often that individuals don't necessarily disengage because of ideological reasons. They entered because of a whole host of reasons, and they exited for similarly complex reasons, usually because they end up hating each other. And that's more the kind of element that's highlighted by that sort of exit stuff. So it's not necessarily a coherent or strong counter-narrative focusing on the ideology. It's more about, certainly the exit programs consisted of, finding old neo-Nazis and putting them in front of school kids and saying, I did this, it was stupid, and, now I got a job. So I think that's the sort of how it was done. But as I say, whether that applies directly to sort of what we're seeing at the moment, which is clearly to some degree new, we don't really know. But there's a lot of learning to be taken from that kind of stuff.
I think I'd echo that. I think a lot of those, the reason why people leave those groups are extraordinarily complex and in a sense become more complex and idiosyncratic. If you go back a sort of generation reading Hasselbach's memoir of, leaving the neo-Nazis, and, one of the moments that really sort of just struck home to him was just a sort of moment of self-consciousness of what the hell are we doing, pretending that we're future Gauleiters in this kind of just bizarre, surreal alternative reality. That was that's what I was talking about, the old status model. They were trying to be the Third Reich again, and that I think that's just gone. I think it's a much more fluid scene, and people's reasons for leaving are often, there's a kind of what I would call a redemptive banality. People, it's just hard to live that kind of, that pace, that level of stress. Other things may become more important, and those may seem very non-ideological reasons, but I think there's something to it. If I can just circle back, if it's not out of turn, just to talk about one of the earlier questions about how do you know who's going to follow through or not. This is not new. My colleague Gilbert Ramsey at St Andrews, and thank you, Bruce, for the generous words about the Centre's long-term views. He wrote a book on the sort of early days of chat forums or fora of the Salafist threat that makes exactly this point that just there's plenty of wannabes, but how the hell you tell them apart from the tiny handful who will take it further is very hard. And he has a wonderful anecdote about some Salafist who didn't have great English but wanted to be part of this movement and uploaded what he thought was a bomb-making recipe in English, but was actually a document called How to Write a Dynamite Resume. So there are problems, and it's even the problem is even older than that. forgive my playing the historian, but I mean, I sometimes feel a kind of strange and sneaking sympathy for the secret head of the secret police in the Hungarian Empire in the early 19th century, 200 years ago, with the sudden proliferation of ideas from the French Revolution, a sort of moment of this massive social experiment that we don't know how it's going to work out, a bit like the internet today. And he concluded, quote, "People will read and read until they become murderers." To some extent, that's what we're still following, but working out which tiny handful will read and read until they become murderers and who won't, if you've got any answers, I'd like to hear them.
All right. Yes, you had a question in front here. And I think this will probably be the last round of questions, actually, so we can move to our break.
So this was touched on a bit with talk of the lab hot air and everything, but regarding incels, how can we inform and educate on the rising threat of violence from them without kind of falling into a moral panic, like what happened after the Joker movie, when a lot of these people might be as much a suicide risk as an attack risk?
Very good question. Anyone else? Yes.
So we've seen an overlap in the types of social media used for white identitarianism, as well as those used for conspiracy theories, such as 4chan and 8chan, and maybe some of the same themes of government distrust and anti-globalism. So do you see an overlap between true right-wing extremism and not directly right-wing conspiracy theories like QAnon, the Great Awakening, or Pizzagate? And do these conspiracy theories serve as a possible pathway to right-wing radicalization?
That's a great question. And Peter?
Thanks, Mark. Just a question to Tim, and I think you know that. A couple of years ago, I was teaching at German Staff Academy, and that was the time when there was this minute of silence for the National Socialist underground and their victims. And I found it quite telling that none of the officers, major to full colonel, actually were prepared to see the street violence that you talked about as a pressing, urgent problem. And it was not terrorism. Terrorism is when things go bang in a spectacular way. If people are just chased through the streets or so, that's more a law and order problem. And there was this grudging acceptance that maybe they are only doing what the police would like to do but can't because it keeps the riffraff off the street and all that stuff. Maybe that's the problem. It's not seeing as an urgent problem. It's seeing maybe kind of, misguided people, they will go out of that and all that stuff. Maybe that's why it's perpetuated. Maybe that's why it's coming back again and again. This feeling for a strong state, the feeling for protection of the family against the other, maybe hardwired into our DNA in a kind of, I'm not a biologist, while the other ideologies, fads of the day, Marxism or whatever, they come and go. But this kind of family, blood and soil or whatever, that stays with us. Maybe that's the problem why it cannot be combated effectively. Just an idea.
Okay.
React to that briefly.
Please.
I think there's something to that, Peter, and perhaps I'm struck by some of the comments about the number of veterans out there now, and perhaps those attitudes that you've just referred to, Peter, are striking. I mean, I still think we're living in a much less militaristic age than 100 years ago, but perhaps there is a sort of still, it's not a time to be complacent. I suppose, I think you're onto something there. I mean, something that really struck me very powerfully being in Germany a year and a half ago at the time of the Chemnitz incident. For those of you who may or may not have been familiar with it, there was the town of Chemnitz in the former Karl-Marx-Stadt, but it's obviously been renamed back to Chemnitz, in the former East Germany. It's kind of classic Rust Belt of East Germany, pretty bombed out. They held a town festival to celebrate being 875 years old, and it made the headlines for all of the wrong reasons. That a German-Cuban citizen of 35 years old was stabbed to death, probably by Syrian, or one of them was, I think, a Syrian refugee or asylum seeker. And the reaction was extraordinary. Within hours, 800 people were basically demonstrating against immigrants. Within a day, it was 6,000, some of them neo-Nazis. So, I mean, those are substantial crowds. Still not on the scale of 1932 or whatever, but, really very substantial. And what was striking about that crises, it seemed to me, was that at every single stage, the German state, in whatever manifestation, whether it was the mayor of Chemnitz or Saxon-Land, the region, or the federal German state, was kind of constantly wrong-footed and on the back foot. Social mobilization, moving through football, hooligan networks, just could put people on the streets far quicker than the authorities seemed to be able to get their act together. It was under-policed. There were kind of horrible scenes of, people being chased through the streets. The head of the German equivalent of MI5, security services, for the protection of the constitution, had to resign, and so on and so forth. So it was a sort of law and order challenge. It was clearly massively underestimated, and really caused some horrible images and scenes. The sequel, though, is interesting, because some people tried to take it further and create a revolution in Chemnitz and start talking about planting bombs, and they were wrapped up within about 3 days. The intelligence services were just onto it. So the sort of way in which the state could be so cack-handed and flat-footed responding to one type of threat, but when it actually put the resources to it, could be much more adroit and adept. That struck me really as speaking to your issue of what we prioritize.
Especially the conspiracy theories.
The question of the conspiracy theories, I think, is a great one. I mean, a couple of points. The first one, obviously, is that conspiracy theories, I guess, are at the heart of most of the ideological threads of the extreme right wing anyway, and always have been. But there's a sort of circle around that, if you like, of I think the conspiracy theories that you mentioned, where there is a risk potentially that they will tie into some of those solutions that extreme right wing organizations and movements might offer. And I think there are two things about those kind of conspiracy theories which are quite striking. One of them is how popular they are, how broadly accepted they can be, way beyond the kind of cohort that you think might be attracted to extreme right-wing solutions, including violence. And the other one is the notion of intent, which is at the heart of conspiracy theories. So it's not just that bad stuff is happening, but that it was the intention of some people to make that bad stuff happen. And I think when you start going down that road, it can be quite dangerous, because then you start seeing groups associated with extreme right wing saying, well, I mean, these are the people we should be focusing on because they're the ones creating harm, and that we have the solutions to do something about that. So I think certainly it's that there's a danger there, that there's a way for it to bridge into milieus that have much, much broader appeals. In that sense, yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, I'll quickly say that I think these conspiracy theories erode the fabric of society and can, of course, they're designed to stir up trouble, and they're designed to encourage people to take matters into their own hands and embrace violent solutions. I mean, the Pizzagate incident with Comet Pizzas is a classic case in point that fortunately tragedy was averted, but only by the thinnest of margins. In terms of the question of interventions and what can we do, well, this is also part of the research that Jacob and Ezra and I are still doing, but one area, and unlike what the president might say, I don't necessarily think terrorism and mental illness or mental health problems are mutually exclusive. I mean, there can be tremendous overlap. But self-admitted extremist incels often claim to be somewhere on the spectrum of autism or to be suffering from profound mental stresses that could be usefully, I think, addressed by mental health professionals with the right kind of intervention, if this is recognized as a problem. And I think that indeed is one of the approaches. And there are people who are engaged in research on this subject. Now, since this was a panel with 3 presenters, there was less time for questions. I'm going to exercise my authority as moderator and cut in 5 minutes into the break and entertain at least 2 final questions from Lord Carlisle and the woman behind him. And then we'll wrap up, since their hands have been up during the previous round.
Thank you for the indulgence. Some articulate critics of British government policy have said to me that disproportionate attention is being given by the British authorities to right-wing extremism, which they argue doesn't represent anything like the threat that is presented by Salafist extremism, and that in fact what it is simply a way of covering up institutional Islamophobia by the British authorities. Leaving that accusation perhaps aside, as experts, how much attention do you really think that government and the authorities should be giving to right-wing extremism when compared with the other forms of extremism commonly taking place?
Okay. And
You mentioned some of the commonalities of the 7 incel attackers that you mentioned in terms of military training, being white males. I was wondering, in terms of background and similar profiles, is there anything you see with regards to education, substance abuse, petty crime, etc.?
Great.
This may be the jet lag kicking in, apologies. So the critics were saying that that far right, that too much attention was given to far right terrorism. Did I understand, or the opposite?
It's because it's basically quite easy to deal with.
Okay, sure. I must confess, I find that a little bit complacent. I found it extraordinary that the way the murder of Joe Cox was shrugged off and how the sort of labelling it as a terrorist act just didn't seem to get purchase in public debate. That seemed to me very disturbing. I mean, certainly Salafists have tried to murder British MPs. They haven't actually managed it. You know, Thomas Mayer did. So from that point of view, I think there's a certain lack of self-awareness there. And yes, as Donald has said, the far right is such a almost inchoate phenomenon. It's hard to generalize. But I think there's a bit of a sort of old school stereotype there that we're talking about sort of low organized, spontaneous hate crimes. Often we are, but on the other side of that is really the poster boys, the masters of massacre, the Breiviks and Tarrants of people who have shown what you can do with spectacular violence pulled off by lone actors with extraordinary dedication, but also with institutional learning. They're getting better at it. They've realized if you corral victims into a space, you can kill more of them. And to see those death tolls creep up, there was a series of machine gun massacres at the end of World War I, of Bloody Sunday in Dublin was a famous one, but there was many others. But they panicking machine gun companies in 1919, 1920 in Europe tended to kill about a third or half of the number of total, Breivik or managed. So, I fear that yes, a lot of far-right violence is relatively easy dealt with if resources are put to it. Yes, it's often very disorganized. I would still say I think there's headroom for expansion and so to speak, greater professionalization of there are templates emerging that disturb me greatly.
I mean, it's a very hard question to answer. There's clearly an uptick in noise, but it's very hard to separate capability from intent and try and kind of assess how likely it is of individuals who are saying things very similar to what Brenton Tarrant said before his attack will actually end up doing anything. But that means it's extremely resource heavy at the moment, but it's very, very difficult to try and assess whether anything akin to the jihadi threat will emerge from that, or whether it will just the vast majority of it will just be chatter, because you have loners coming from nowhere whose capability is extremely minimal. But it's very, very difficult to try and assess whether they're likely to become a threat or not. And I think we're in this kind of a period now where the scene is just very, very unclear. There's clearly the recruits who are attracted to this cause are in a number of ways different from what we've seen in the past. We see these kind of movements and ideologies being popular on the university campuses, for example, which is not something we've seen in the UK for a long time. So something clearly has changed in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of support for some of these movements and solutions, but to what extent that will translate into action is a question which is even more difficult on this front, as Bruce mentioned, than it has been on the jihadi front, I think.
Right. I would say that we expect those charged with protecting us to protect us from all threats and not to be selective. That's not to say that there's not a very different type of threat that's posed by global Salafi jihadist movements that have 10,000s of men at arms, that are well organized, that have funding streams that are supporting subversive activities in regions and countries throughout the world. But at the same time, that doesn't mean also turning one's back on what are palpable threats within our own country. It's always, I think, in responding to threats, are questions of prioritization and allocation of resources. But that's different from then writing off or ignoring threats, even the ones, let's say, from violent incels, which seem at a very different level, a different extreme than, let's say, the threat posed by ISIS. And then finally, about the demographic profile. I mean, it's very interesting because on incel.co, one of these websites, there was a survey. Let's say it's only authoritative as the persons who responded to it. Let's say it's not sweeping in necessarily the most violent, extreme fringe of the movement. But what was interesting amongst the respondents is overwhelmingly or predominantly Caucasian male from middle and upper middle class backgrounds, but interestingly, with a disproportionate lack of education. Many of them were high school dropouts or only had completed high school. Despite the advantages socioeconomically they might have had, they were not university graduates, so had gone to graduate school. So in other words, there are people that operated within or existed within a very small and narrow echo chamber where the discourse and dialogue just served to confirm their extremist views rather than broadening their minds in any meaningful sense. So with that, I've cut into 9 minutes of your break, for which I apologize. We still have 21 minutes to network and have coffee. Please join me in thanking Tim and Donald and myself for this panel.